I want to tell you the story of a girl named Susie Smith. Susie, after graduating, got a couple of credit card offers in the mail, and she thought that was pretty cool. She thought, hey, I can go spend money that I don't have, but I can work it off and eventually pay it off. So she takes her credit cards and goes out and starts shopping, buying something nice for herself, and she gets a little out of control. She ends up racking up about $5,000 in debt. Now, in order to pay that off, she's got to work extra hard, but while she's working hard, she has to keep paying bills and spending money, and eventually loses sight of her ultimate goal, which is to become debt-free. And eventually, she starts getting even deeper in debt. Susie eventually has nowhere to turn but to declare bankruptcy. At this point, she has nowhere left to turn, and she's hit rock bottom. After defaulting on her credit card, she pretty much becomes financially caustic. No bank will touch her for a loan, and she can't go in and find a nice husband to marry and hope that his credit will carry her over, because that also doesn't work. The credit card companies will actually look at her as a liability. Now, this might strike a few of you as a little too close to home, and it might be a tragic story, but what I want to talk to you about is not just one person, but rather what happens when this happens to an entire country, and that is United States debt. Next slide. Now, all of you have probably heard the term inflation before, but not many of you probably know that it has two meanings. Inflation can both mean just the gradual rise of the cost of living, but it can also mean the weakening of the dollar against other currencies. Inflation happens when the country basically has no more money to spend and it needs an IOU. So what does it do? It goes to the United States Federal Reserve. When it goes to the Federal Reserve, it says, we know that we're good for the money. We have all these people who are paying their taxes, so bail us out. And so what do? They print more money. And when they print more money, that means that all the other money that's out in circulation is worth less. And when that happens, things start costing more, and the process continues. Now, this has happened quite a lot since the creation of the country, as you can see here on this graph. Ever since the creation of the United States, all inflation rates have been calculated out. The blue on the graph is inflation, the green is deflation. What happens when the Federal Reserve goes back and tries to fight inflation? And for a couple hundred years, that really has been working pretty well. All the blue is countered by green and so on and so forth, until we get up until about 1950, when it stops getting deflation and inflation just continues to rise and rise and pile up. Now, what does this mean for us? It means that things cost more, but we get paid more. But the unfortunate reality of that is that it hurts something called investment. And investments are one of the basic founding principles of building an economy. When someone makes an investment in a company, they buy in at a certain money level, and that means that they have a certain amount of money to spend on something, and they have a fixed value on this item or company or whatever. And then as the company gets better or the investment gets more valuable, they make more money. But when inflation happens, their investment becomes less valuable, and therefore what they had invested in becomes less valuable, and people are less likely to invest. Next slide, please. Now, inflation is a very tricky matter, and there's a lot more that can be said about it. But there's another problem behind debt, and that is the annual budget. The budget is ultimately what causes inflation, and specifically when the budget is unbalanced, it causes inflation. There are two parts to the national budget. There's discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Mandatory spending has to be spent as it's laid out, no questions. And as you can see by this graph, mandatory spending consists of well over 60% of the entire national income. Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, interest towards current existing debt, all other mandatory spending are actually the regular mandatory spending that cannot be touched. And then there's the Defense Department. Everything else in the entire budget is all of the other things that our tax dollars pay for. Everything from fire departments to police to roads, everything else. Now, what does that mean? It means that as the mandatory spending gets larger, we have less to spend on everything else. Now, we all know that debt eventually gets bigger and bigger, and we've pretty much been in debt since the country started, but we haven't defaulted or anything like that. So how is that? We keep getting bigger and bigger debts. Why aren't we, bankrupt or anything like that? And that's because of debt and GDP. Now, a country is a little bit different from a person because it has a lot more credibility. It can actually spend money that it doesn't have, basically because it has a lot of credibility behind it. It has a really strong economy, and it knows that it can get a lot of cash really quickly, and it is pretty strong. This graph shows the relationship between the total amount of debt that our country has had since 1940 versus how strong our economy is. At 1940, our debt was pretty large, for the time, and its percent of GDP was even larger, namely about 120% of GDP, which would mean that we owed more than a year's worth of our entire economy income. Not taxable dollars, but every dollar earned by every American around the country. Now, when the ratio is low, that means that we're doing well. It means that we can handle this kind of debt relatively well, and that we can get pretty strong movement. We can handle ourselves. But when it starts to decline, it means that we have less and less to deal with. Next slide. Now, the consequences for this, what it eventually means is that as the debt gets bigger, we have to feed the debt more and more and more and more, and until eventually we can't pay off our debt anymore. And what happens when that eventually comes true? It means we break the bank. So, in conclusion, I hope that I've shown that the national debt is quite a real threat and much bigger than any of us have ever seen. Thank you.
You want to go ahead and get on a roll?
Where's my list? Oh, well, I need it. All right, so, RC, what did you think?
Thought everything was put together pretty well. I like the examples he gave. I also like everything that I pretty much studied because I know a lot about this subject as well. And so everything that I thought he should have said, he said it. So I was pretty impressed. And he pretty much explained everything extremely well. I think the one thing I can say about him, he was calm there, but if he could stop saying like that would just complete his whole speech.
All right. All right.
Bad word I can say about it.
Not bad words, they're just observations.
There you go.
All right. Well, let me observe how much I enjoyed your story at the beginning as a way to get started. I thought that worked really well. It does need to be maybe a little bit shorter because it's almost 2 minutes into the speech before you get to your real topic. It's 1:47 by the time you reveal what your topic is. Although the truth is you've kind of revealed what the topic is because you put that slide up from the very beginning. I think that would have been better to get to right at the end of your story about Susan the spendaholic, who and then say, well, we're actually talking about, and then you can add that in, and I think it would have been fine. So you indicate the subject material. I like all of that at the beginning. You do need more of a preview, because there's not really a setup of what the content's going to be. Now, the organization is not that hard. It's topical in nature, and you've got a slide that introduces each one of those sections, and usually you have pretty good transition as you're getting to those points. But I didn't know what was coming up, and so as each one came up, I said, okay, well, there's that. I hadn't thought about how investment is going to be affected by the debt issue and how it fits into these kinds of things. So I can understand what you're talking about now, but it seemed, looking at it, maybe it feels a little bit less involved or less appropriate than some of the other points that you had. Like I said, each of the points, though, is introduced pretty clearly, and you made the movement between the points well. I thought you had good definitions, and you explained concepts really well. There's no support material that's presented. I didn't hear a source citation for anything. There is source citations on some of the visuals that tells us where you're getting some of that material, so that helps a little bit. I thought that the audience interest is good at the beginning because of your story, and then you need to kind of relate those stories. Again, let's go back, and as you're talking about some of these things, give us some practical examples. Like when you were talking about investment and how people might not want to invest, well, what are some of those consequences that we're going to run into because of the debt ratio that we have that people wouldn't want to invest in, that we're going to have to pay a higher rate on borrowing that we take, those kinds of things. Maybe give us some examples about not being able to sell treasury bonds to China or something along those lines. I don't know, something that makes it a little bit more concrete. I thought you did a nice job presenting too, except that I did feel like you were presenting to me most of the time. When you watch the video back, I think you're going to notice that most of your focus is right here, and I don't know how the rest of the audience felt, but I can't say I felt left out, but I know that I did sometimes feel like, isn't there anybody else in this room? Maybe you should distribute your attention a little bit. We're going to work on that on the next go-round, so that's not a big deal now. All right, thank you.